Hey everyone, tonight we're diving headfirst into a peculiar corner of history, a detail so odd you might just find yourself adjusting your own pajamas in disbelief. Imagine, if you will, the flickering candlelight of an Elizabethan bedchamber. The air is thick with the scent of dried herbs, perhaps a hint of wood smoke from the hearth, and the faintest whiff of, well, let's just say unfreshed linen. You're there, standing beside a magnificent, carved oak bed, draped in rich velvet and heavy tapestries. You might picture a nobleman or lady, perhaps ready to slip into a pristine nightgown, shedding the day's elaborate finery. But what if I told you that, more often than not, they weren't changing at all? You probably won't survive this journey without a few shivers, as we unravel the surprisingly uncozy truth of how Elizabethan nobles actually slept, or rather, how they didn't really prepare for sleep in the way we understand it today. It's a reality check that will make you appreciate your soft, clean sheets and breathable loungewear just a little bit more. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in, let me know where you are and what time it is. Right now, it's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Feel free to like and follow the channel to continue waiting for the next exciting parts. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle in, let's first set the scene for an Elizabethan evening. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and the short, intense burst of daylight that defined much of their outdoor life is fading. For the nobility, this transition didn't immediately herald a rush to disrobe and relax. Instead, the evening often brought a different set of social obligations and domestic routines. Think about it during the day. Your life as an Elizabethan noble was a carefully choreographed performance. Every stitch of your doublet, every pleat in your ruff, every gem on your finger spoke volumes about your status, your wealth, and your loyalty. You were a walking billboard of aristocratic power, and that performance didn't simply cease when the sun went down. Your servants, always nearby, would be busy. Perhaps they'd be bringing in more candles or tending to the fireplaces, preparing the chambers for the night. You might have had a light supper, more of a collation, really, after the main meal of the day, which was usually eaten in the mid-afternoon. There could be an evening of music or reading aloud from a precious, hand-copied manuscript. Even as the hours grew late, the concept of a completely private, solitary unwinding was a foreign one. Your chamber, while ostensibly personal, was still a semi-public space, with attendants constantly entering and exiting, assisting with various needs. This constant presence of others, even in your private quarters, fundamentally shaped how you approach something as seemingly simple as preparing for bed. Historians still argue whether the perceived lack of privacy was a societal norm or a necessary security measure in an era of intrigue. It wasn't about stripping down to your undies and flopping onto the bed. It was about shifting gears. Yes, but often remaining very much on. Your elaborate clothing, so vital to your daytime identity, didn't simply vanish at bedtime. So, you've navigated the social intricacies of the Elizabethan evening, perhaps enjoyed a glass of spiced wine, and now, finally, the hour grows late. You might be envisioning that satisfying moment of peeling off tight corsets or heavy doublets, releasing a sigh of relief as you slip into something more comfortable. Forget it. For many Elizabethan nobles, the concept of slipping into something more comfortable was, shall we say, significantly less slippy than you'd imagine. In fact, for a surprising number of them, more comfortable meant little more than loosening a few laces, maybe removing a ruff, and then simply lying down, fully dressed. Yes, you heard that right. While the absolute poorest might have slept in the rough clothes they wore all day out of sheer necessity, for the wealthy elite, it was a choice, a convention. You, as a noble person, might simply remove your outer gown or doublet, perhaps your elaborate ruff if it was particularly cumbersome, and then recline on your bed in your remaining layers. This often included your linen shirt or chemise, the closest thing they had to underwear, along with breeches or a petticoat, and sometimes even your stockings. Imagine trying to get a decent night's sleep with your breeches still cinched at the waist, or your long stockings clinging to your legs. It sounds utterly bizarre to our modern sensibilities, akin to sleeping in your finest suit or a ball gown. One could almost hear a tiny, historical voice whispering, "But darling, what if someone calls upon you unexpectedly in the middle of the night?" The practical reasons for this peculiar habit were manifold, and they paint a vivid picture of daily life that was far removed from our climate-controlled, privacy-laden existences. For starters, warmth was a crucial factor. Your grand manor, while impressive, was likely a drafty, stone-built edifice that offered little insulation against the biting English chill, even indoors. Central heating, a concept as fantastical as a flying carriage. Fireplaces provided some warmth, but it dissipated quickly, and the concept of keeping a roaring fire going all night was both dangerous and impractical. Those layers of wool, linen, and even silk served as a personal insulating bubble. Stripping down to a thin nightshirt would have been an invitation to shiver through the long, dark hours. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation was warmth or simply ingrained social custom. Then there was the sheer effort involved in dressing and undressing. Your garments weren't simply slipped on and off. They were elaborate constructions, often requiring the assistance of servants. Laces, pins, ties, and multiple layers meant that getting in and out of your daily attire was a significant undertaking, not a quick 5-minute affair. To go through that entire laborious process twice a day, once for bed, once for morning, seemed an unnecessary expenditure of time and energy when you could simply loosen a few things and be ready for sleep. It's like when you're utterly exhausted after a long day and decide the effort of putting on pajamas just isn't worth it. Multiply that by a factor of 10 for Elizabethan clothing. Furthermore, the concept of nightwear as a distinct category of clothing was only just beginning to emerge. And even then, it was more about adding layers for warmth rather than subtracting them for comfort. A proper nightshirt was a luxury, worn by very few, and often layered over existing garments for extra warmth on particularly cold nights. It wasn't a liberating piece of clothing. It was another addition to the sartorial fortress you built around yourself. So, as you finally lay down, perhaps pulling a heavy wool blanket over your still-dressed form, you're not just going to sleep, you're maintaining a state of readiness, a practical shield against the elements and, perhaps, the unexpected intrusions of the night. You've just settled onto that grand Elizabethan bed, still encased in a surprising number of your day's garments. Let's talk about those layers, because they weren't just fabric, they were a meticulously constructed statement of your wealth, your status, and your very identity. Imagine trying to sleep cocooned in what amounts to a wearable architectural marvel. For you, the nobleman, this would mean a linen shirt closest to the skin, a sort of base layer, which was sometimes changed daily, sometimes not, depending on your personal habits and resources. Over that, your breeches, often made of wool or velvet, sometimes padded, and reaching just below the knee and above the waist, a doublet, a close-fitting jacket, often stiffened and padded, designed to give you that fashionable, broad-shouldered silhouette. Your lady, on the other hand, would be similarly encased. Her innermost layer would be a chemise, a loose-fitting linen shift. Over this, a kirtle, a basic dress, often sleeveless, which formed the foundation for her more elaborate garments. Then came the corset, or stays as they were called, a rigid garment designed to flatten the front and push the breasts up, creating the fashionable conical shape. And yes, many women either slept in their stays, loosened but not removed, or in softer, less restrictive versions specifically for night. On top of this, a petticoat or two, and then perhaps an outer gown. All of these layers were fastened with an intricate system of laces, points, ties, and pins. Undoing all of them felt like dismantling a small fortress. It's no wonder they often just decided, nah, I'll deal with this in the morning. It's a bit like deciding to sleep in your favorite, slightly too tight jeans after a big meal, just because the thought of unbuttoning them feels like too much effort. Only multiply the effort by about 20. These garments weren't just for show, they were also a form of personal climate control. Remember those drafty castles, each layer trapped air, providing insulation? The heavier the fabric, the warmer you were. Wool, linen, and silk were the predominant materials, with velvet and brocade reserved for the outermost, most visible layers. Sleeping in them meant you woke up, perhaps a little rumpled, but certainly not frozen. It was a practical solution to an unheated reality, even if it seems profoundly uncomfortable to us. Historians still argue whether the concept of comfort, as we define it today, even existed for the Elizabethans, or if their understanding was simply different, prioritizing warmth and readiness over softness and looseness. The social significance of clothing also played a massive role. Your clothes were your identity, your class signifier, your personal branding. To be seen in anything less than impeccable attire, even by your servants, could be perceived as a slip in decorum. While completely disrobing was not scandalous in private, being caught unawares, unprepared, was certainly an embarrassment. So, by sleeping in most of your clothes, you maintained a semblance of your daytime persona, ready to spring to action, or at least appear respectable, should an unexpected visitor or emergency arise in the middle of the night. It's almost like having a perpetual business casual dress code, even for your dreams. A quirky tidbit, some nobles even wore light caps to bed, not just for warmth, but also to protect their elaborate hairstyles, which were often a significant investment of time and effort for their servants to create daily. Imagine waking up with hat hair every morning, but it's intentional, truly a different world. You're now lying in your grand Elizabethan bed, feeling the weight of those numerous layers. But let's not just talk about your attire. Let's talk about the bed itself, because it was far more than just a place to sleep. For the Elizabethan noble, the bed was often the most expensive and elaborate piece of furniture in the entire household, a towering monument to wealth and status. Think less cozy nook and more ornate, multi-person sleeping apparatus that sometimes served as a mini-stage for morning audiences. These beds, often called great beds, were colossal. They typically featured heavy wooden frames, intricately carved with mythical beasts, heraldic symbols, or classical motifs. Four massive posts rose upwards, supporting a canopy from which rich fabrics, velvet, damask, brocade were draped, sometimes floor-length, creating a veritable room within a room. This wasn't just for aesthetics. Those heavy hangings provided crucial insulation against the chill and, perhaps just as importantly, a degree of visual privacy in an era where true solitude was a luxury rarely afforded. You might be tucked away inside your fabric fortress, but the world outside it, even within your own chamber, was still very much alive. And who else might be in or around this magnificent sleeping machine? Well, quite a few people, actually. The idea of a bed being solely for one or two conjugal partners is a surprisingly modern invention. For Elizabethan nobles, especially those with numerous children, their beds were often shared. Your younger children might sleep in the same bed with you and your spouse, or certainly in close proximity in trundle beds pulled out from underneath, or even on pallets on the floor nearby. This wasn't a sign of poverty, but a common practice, both for warmth and for the continuous supervision of heirs. Imagine trying to get a good night's rest with a squirming toddler just inches away, even if they were also fully dressed. It puts a whole new spin on co-sleeping, doesn't it? Beyond immediate family, servants were often within earshot, if not directly in the same room. A chambermaid might sleep on a pallet at the foot of your bed, or in an adjoining closet-sized room, ready to attend to your needs at a moment's notice. Valets or pages might also be close by. The great bed, therefore, became a hub of activity, a semi-public space even in the dead of night. This constant presence of others further solidified the habit of sleeping fully or mostly dressed. You wouldn't want to be caught in a state of undress should a servant need to enter, or should you suddenly be required for some unforeseen emergency. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for servant proximity was convenience for the noble or a subtle form of surveillance. A quirky tidbit: some of these great beds were so large and so valuable that they were considered part of the family's wealth and were even bequeathed in wills, specifically named as prized possessions. They were built to last for generations, almost like a piece of real estate you could lie down in. So, as you shifted, perhaps trying to find a comfortable position amidst all your layers and the rustling of the bed hangings, you were not just in a bed, you were in a statement, a sanctuary, and a very public private space all at once. So you're nestled in your magnificent bed, perhaps sharing it with a child or two, and certainly within earshot of servants. You're still mostly dressed, the layers providing a comforting, albeit slightly restrictive, warmth against the chill of the unheated chamber. This brings us, rather ungracefully perhaps, to the topic of Elizabethan hygiene, or, more accurately, the Elizabethan approach to hygiene, which differed wildly from our own. Understanding this helps explain why sleeping fully dressed wasn't seen as quite the gross aberration we might consider it today. Imagine, for a moment, the daily reality of personal cleanliness in an era before running water, widespread plumbing, and the germ theory of disease. For you, the Elizabethan noble, a bath was an event, not a routine. It was a production, requiring vast quantities of heated water to be lugged from well or river, a large wooden tub to be set up, and servants to assist with the entire arduous process. Consequently, full-body bathing might only happen a few times a year, perhaps seasonally, or before significant events. The idea of a daily shower or even a quick nightly wash was simply impractical and, frankly, unheard of for the vast majority of the population, regardless of status. Instead, their hygiene revolved around a concept of dry cleaning. This meant regular changes of the innermost linen layers, the shirt or chemise, which were believed to absorb bodily fluids and dirt, effectively acting as a sacrificial barrier between your skin and your outer garments. These linen shifts were then laundered, often with lye soap and vigorous beating, which was the closest they got to true cleanliness. However, the outer garments, your doublets, gowns, breeches, and petticoats, were rarely, if ever, washed. They were brushed, aired, and perhaps spot cleaned, but a full wash would ruin their intricate construction and expensive fabrics. It's like how you might air out a fancy suit instead of dry cleaning it after every wear. Only applied to almost everything you owned. This brings us back to the bed. If your clothes weren't being frequently washed anyway, the perceived dirtiness of sleeping in them was simply less of an issue. The idea of shedding your outer clothes and exposing your skin to potentially unclean bed linens, which, while changed more often than outer garments, still weren't laundered with modern thoroughness, might have even seemed counterintuitive. Your clothes, in a way, were your protective layer against the world, and that included the world of the bed. Historians still argue whether the lack of bathing was purely practical or also rooted in prevailing medical beliefs about water opening pores to disease, a quirky tidbit to combat unpleasant odors from unwashed clothing and bodies. Elizabethan nobles relied heavily on perfumes, pomanders, decorative balls filled with aromatic substances, and sachets of dried herbs placed within their garments or bedding. So, while you might not have been showering, you were likely walking around enveloped in a cloud of lavender, rosemary, and perhaps a hint of civet or musk. Imagine falling asleep with a tiny, fragrant orb tucked into your sleeve, just to make the whole sleeping, fully dressed thing a bit more palatable. It's a rather charming, if somewhat ineffective, form of historical air freshener. You're still there, in that vast Elizabethan bed, layered up against the chill, perhaps with the faint scent of dried herbs wafting from a sachet tucked nearby. But let's be brutally honest for a moment: hygiene, as we've discussed, was a different beast. And where there's less rigorous cleaning, there are often more uninvited guests. Yes, we need to talk about the creepy crawlies. The unfortunate reality for Elizabethan nobles, despite their wealth and status, was a constant battle with vermin, itches, and the general discomfort that came from living in close quarters with the less than spotless natural world. Imagine trying to sleep, not just with the occasional mosquito, but with the persistent annoyance of fleas and lice. These tiny creatures were ubiquitous, thriving in the warm folds of clothing, bedding, and human hair. They didn't discriminate between pauper and prince. Everyone had them. You might wake up in the morning with new, irritating bites, and the nightly ritual for many would involve a good scratch, perhaps even a casual hunt for the offending pests. It's certainly a far cry from the pristine, hypoallergenic sheets you might be accustomed to. It makes that sleeping fully dressed habit even stranger when you consider the potential for more hiding places for these unwelcome bedfellows. It's enough to make your skin crawl, isn't it? The constant itching wasn't just a minor nuisance. It could be a significant source of discomfort and distraction. And while they didn't understand the link between these pests and disease in the way we do, they certainly recognized the irritation. People carried small combs, often made of ivory or bone, specifically for delousing their hair and clothing. Some even developed elaborate techniques for scratching without appearing too undignified in public, a true mark of aristocratic self-control. Beyond the biting insects, there was also the presence of larger, less mobile pests. Rodents, specifically rats and mice, were a constant feature of Elizabethan homes, noble or otherwise. They scurried through walls, gnawed on stored food, and sometimes made appearances in living and sleeping quarters. Imagine the unsettling rustle in the night, the faint scratch of tiny claws. While your bed might have been grand and elevated, it wasn't an impenetrable fortress against a determined mouse. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of bed hangings was primarily for warmth or also served as a psychological barrier against unseen nighttime intrusions. So, as you lay there, perhaps feeling a faint tickle or an undeniable itch, you weren't just contending with the cold or the stiffness of your clothes. You were part of an ecosystem, a rather lively one at that. It adds a whole new layer of appreciation for modern pest control, doesn't it? A quirky tidbit to try and deter fleas. Some people would sprinkle sweet-smelling herbs like pennyroyal or lavender in their beds and among their clothes. Others would hang bundles of wormwood or rue. It was a constant, aromatic, and often losing battle against the tiny inhabitants of their world. So that gentle ASR hum you're hearing now, imagine it punctuated by phantom scratches and the occasional, very real, scurry, pleasant dreams. So, you're in bed, layers still on, perhaps subconsciously scratching in phantom itch, and surrounded by the rustle of your substantial bed hangings. But even as you lay there, trying to catch some Elizabethan Z's, your attire, or lack of its complete removal, wasn't just about warmth or convenience or even pest control. It was fundamentally about social standing and public display. In Elizabethan England, every thread, every button, every visible accessory was a carefully curated message, and that message didn't entirely cease when you lay down to rest. Imagine your life as a noble, a constant performance. From the moment you rose, assisted by servants who presented your carefully chosen garments, to your appearances at court, your public meals, and your interactions with a vast network of clients and dependents, you were always on stage. Your clothing was your uniform, distinguishing you immediately from the lower classes and subtly, but powerfully, from those of lesser noble rank. A commoner might wear homespun wool. You, a noble, would be swathed in fine broadcloth, velvet, silk, perhaps even adorned with gold thread and pearls. This ingrained understanding of clothing as a direct extension of one's identity meant that even in moments we'd consider private, a degree of formality persisted. To be seen by your servants or by unexpected visitors, a common occurrence in an era with less rigid boundaries between public and private space, in a state of undress was not just a matter of modesty, but of status. It could imply a lack of readiness, a vulnerability, or even a disregard for your own standing. By sleeping in many of your clothes, you maintained a semblance of your daytime grandeur, ensuring that if you had to rise suddenly, or if a chambermaid entered, you wouldn't appear undone. Historians still argue whether this habit was more about maintaining an outward appearance or an internal sense of dignity. Think about it, your finest clothing wasn't merely fabric, it was an investment. An elaborate gown or a richly embroidered doublet could cost as much as a small cottage, or even a modest estate. These weren't garments to be tossed aside carelessly, crumpled into a heap at the foot of the bed. They were valuable possessions, treated with respect and care. Laying down in them, perhaps carefully arranged to avoid too many wrinkles, was a way of treating them with the deference they deserved. It's like how you might carefully hang up an expensive suit or dress rather than throwing it on the floor. Even if you're exhausted, this was just taking that consideration a step further, right into the bed. A quirky tidbit, some nobles would even have specific nightcaps or coifs that were part of their sleep attire, often made of fine linen or even silk, sometimes embroidered. These weren't just for warmth, they were a final touch of decorum, ensuring that even your head was dressed while you slept. It was another subtle way to maintain that polished, aristocratic image, even in slumber. So, as you drift off, know that even your dreams are perhaps subtly influenced by the unwavering demands of Elizabethan social hierarchy. You're still in that majestic bed, still in your multi-layered ensemble, the weight of velvet or wool a constant, comforting pressure. We've touched upon the social statement of your clothes, but let's delve deeper into the sheer, unyielding grip of Elizabethan fashion itself. This wasn't just about looking good. It was about participating in a sartorial arms race. And the impracticalities of these trends directly influenced why undressing fully for bed was simply not on the agenda for most nobles. Imagine your daytime attire for you, the gentleman, that might include a padded doublet, stiffened to create a broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted silhouette. Your breeches could be puffed and slashed, revealing contrasting fabrics underneath, or perhaps trunk hose, ballooning out from your waist like enormous gourds, and around your neck, the ubiquitous ruff, a starched, often wire-supported collar of linen or lace, sometimes a foot wide, restricting head movement and ensuring you carried yourself with an almost regal stiffness. Try to imagine comfortably laying your head on a pillow with a dinner plate-sized ruff encasing your neck. It's simply not happening without a significant amount of discomfort or, more likely, careful removal. For the lady, the fashion dictates were even more extreme in terms of their structural demands. Her stays, as we discussed, molded her torso into a conical shape, often with a flat front. Over this, a farthingale or a bum roll might be worn, devices designed to expand the skirt dramatically, creating an almost architectural silhouette. Sleeves could be enormous, puffed, and elaborately decorated. The sheer volume and rigidity of these garments meant that simply slipping them off was impossible. They were constructed pieces, almost like wearable sculptures, and required careful unlacing, unpinning, and even dismantling. Historians still argue whether the extreme stiffness of Elizabethan fashion was a deliberate attempt to assert social control or merely an aesthetic preference of the time. The process of getting dressed in the morning and undressed at night was therefore a complex, time-consuming ritual that often required the skilled hands of several servants. It wasn't a quick change, it was a production. To go through this elaborate process twice a day seemed a colossal waste of effort, when a few loosened laces and a discarded outer gown could suffice. It's the ultimate too-much-effort decision, taken to an aristocratic extreme. It's like when you put on a really intricate Halloween costume, and by the end of the night, you just want to collapse in it rather than spend another hour trying to get out. For Elizabethans, every day was Halloween. Sartorially speaking, a quirky tidbit, the ruff, that iconic symbol of Elizabethan fashion, was so incredibly impractical that special rough irons, like curling irons and starching techniques, were developed to maintain its crisp, unyielding shape. You definitely wouldn't want to crush that masterpiece by sleeping on it. Surana, while you might remove the most restrictive elements like your ruff or an outer gown, the bulk of your clothing remained, a testament to the fact that convenience often bowed before the formidable demands of fashion. You're still in that bed, perhaps with a slight crick in your neck from the phantom memory of a ruff and the full awareness of your many layers. But let's flip the script to the other end of the sleep cycle, the morning. For the Elizabethan noble, the start of the day was not a leisurely affair. It was often a swift transition from slumber to social engagement, and this pressing need for morning routine swiftness played a significant role in why you rarely, if ever, fully undressed. Imagine the dawn. Your chamber, while grand, is still cold and dimly lit by the first rays of light filtering through heavy curtains. There's no snooze button. Instead, your servants are already stirring, ready to assist. For a person of your standing, the morning wasn't just about personal preparation. It was about presenting yourself, often to an expectant court, to visiting dignitaries, or to a retinue of clients and petitioners. This required a quick turnaround, and being mostly dressed already was a huge head start. Think about the sheer amount of time it saved. If you had to completely undress every night and then completely redress every morning, that would add a considerable chunk of time to both your evening and morning routines. Each lace tied, each pin secured, each layer arranged. It all took precious minutes. By remaining in your underlayers, or even most of your daily clothes, you cut out a significant portion of that labor-intensive process. You might simply need to don your outer gown or doublet, adjust your ruff if you removed it, and perhaps have your hair dressed. It was efficiency born of necessity, a historical speed hack for aristocratic living. This swiftness wasn't just about saving time, it was about maintaining control and projecting an image of readiness. A noble was expected to be available, to command, to receive. Being caught in a state of prolonged disarray would have been highly undignified. Your morning levee, or getting up ceremony, could even be a semi-public event where important figures would visit your bedchamber to pay respects or conduct business while you were still in your bed. Imagine trying to conduct serious state affairs while fumbling with your breeches. Not a good look. Historians still argue whether the morning levee was primarily a display of power or a practical means for early governance. A quirky tidbit to further expedite the morning: some nobles would even sleep in their stockings, sometimes made of silk or fine wool. This meant one less item to pull on in the cold morning air, ensuring your feet were warm and ready to be slipped into your elaborate shoes almost immediately. It's like how you might sleep in your gym clothes if you're planning an early morning workout, a preemptive strike against the discomfort of the cold and the drag of getting ready. Your Elizabethan counterpart just did it with significantly more lace and velvet. You've just mentally whisked yourself from the Elizabethan bed to the beginning of the day, appreciating the efficiency of remaining largely dressed. But now let's pivot to a more somber, yet equally compelling, reason for this odd habit: security in a dangerous age. Elizabethan England, for all its cultural flourishing, was not a safe, predictable world. It was a realm simmering with political intrigue, religious tensions, and the ever-present threat of assassination, rebellion, or foreign invasion. Being able to spring into action, or at least appear ready for it, was more than just good manners. It could be a matter of life or death. Imagine you are a powerful noble, perhaps with influence at court, or commanding a significant estate. You are a target. Plots, real or imagined, were a constant feature of the political landscape. A sudden alarm in the night, a fire, a raid by disgruntled neighbors, a spy attempting to infiltrate your household, or even a direct attack was not an impossibility. If you were fully undressed, fumbling in the dark for your clothes, you would be vulnerable and slow to react. Being mostly dressed, however, meant you could grab a weapon, rally your household guards, or simply make a swifter escape should the unthinkable occur. This wasn't mere paranoia. It was a pragmatic approach to survival. Castles and manor houses, while imposing, were not impenetrable fortresses. Doors could be battered down, windows forced open. The concept of home security was less about alarms and more about armed retainers and a state of perpetual readiness. Even within the confines of your own family, rivalries and betrayals were not uncommon. One never knew when an enemy, or even a jealous relative, might strike. Historians still argue whether the level of real danger justified such pervasive vigilance, or if it was amplified by the era's dramatic political climate. Consider the role of your servants, too. Their proximity, as discussed, offered convenience, but also a layer of defense. Yet, even with them, you wouldn't want to be caught in a compromising position should they suddenly need to report an urgent matter or defend you. Your clothes were, in a way, a soft armor, allowing you to maintain dignity and preparedness even in the liminal state between sleep and waking. It's like how an elite soldier might sleep in their fatigues, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. Only for the Elizabethan noble, the battlefield was often their very own bedchamber. A quirky tidbit, some nobles kept a dagger or a small sword tucked beneath their pillow or close by their bed. This, combined with sleeping mostly dressed, meant that if a shadowy figure appeared in the flickering candlelight, you weren't caught completely off guard. You could transition from slumber to self-defense with relative speed. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps in your softest pajamas, spare a thought for your Elizabethan counterpart, who was always in a subtle yet profound way, ready for battle, even in their dreams. You're still lying there, a historical action figure, perpetually ready for anything, even in slumber. This underlying thread of preparedness, born of both social expectation and genuine danger, becomes even more pronounced when you consider the realities of the travel and lodging and improvised sleep in Elizabethan England. Life for a noble wasn't confined to a single, grand manor. You were often on the move, journeying between estates, attending court, visiting friends, or overseeing distant lands. And when you traveled, your sleep habits adapted, or rather, solidified, the practice of sleeping mostly dressed. Imagine setting out on a journey. Roads were often rudimentary, muddy tracks, and travel was slow and arduous, typically on horseback or by cumbersome coach. Inns along the way varied wildly in quality, from relatively comfortable establishments to squalid, flea-ridden hovels. You, the noble traveler, might arrive exhausted, covered in dust or mud, and seeking immediate rest. The thought of meticulously undressing in an unfamiliar, potentially unsanitary, and often public bedchamber would have been far from appealing. The beds in these inns, even the better ones, were rarely as grand or as clean as your own at home. They were communal spaces, often shared with strangers, or at least with numerous other travelers in multi-person rooms. Privacy was virtually non-existent. In such circumstances, retaining your clothes offered a sense of personal space, a protective layer against the unknown cleanliness of the mattress and blankets, and a psychological barrier against the proximity of others. It was a practical solution to a less than ideal sleeping environment. It's a bit like when you're staying in a questionable motel and decide to sleep in your clothes rather than risk direct contact with the suspicious-looking sheets. For hygiene. Furthermore, spontaneous or improvised sleeping arrangements were not uncommon. You might be visiting a friend's lesser estate, staying in a hunting lodge, or even making do on a campaign. These situations rarely afforded the luxury of a private changing room or an attentive retinue of servants to assist with elaborate nightly undressing. Being able to simply loosen your belt, kick off your shoes, and collapse into a temporary bed while still in your breeches and shirt was a matter of sheer expediency. Historians still argue whether the discomfort of travel was a greater driver of this habit than the perceived benefits of warmth and security. A quirky tidbit, some nobles carried special traveling shirts or thinner underdoublets specifically for journeys, which might have been slightly more comfortable to sleep in than their heavy court attire. But even these were still far from modern pajamas. You were still essentially sleeping in a modified version of your day clothes, a pragmatic adaptation to a world where comfort was a distant second to practical necessity. So, As you drift off, imagine the rattling of a coach, the distant bray of an inn's donkey, and the subtle discomfort of sleeping in your finest, most durable travel attire. You're still feeling those layers, perhaps now with a phantom jostling sensation from an imaginary journey. Beyond the practicalities of warmth, security, and travel, the Elizabethan habit of sleeping fully dressed was also deeply intertwined with the prevailing medical beliefs and humoral theory or in Tash of the era. This wasn't just about what felt comfortable, it was about what was believed to be healthy for your body according to the science of the day. And trust me, their science was different. The dominant medical paradigm of the time was Galenic humoral theory, which had been around since ancient Greece. This theory posited that the human body was composed of four fundamental humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. The balance of these humors determined your temperament, health, and susceptibility to disease. Illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance, and maintaining health involved keeping these humors in equilibrium. So, what does this have to do with sleeping fully dressed? Well, one of the key tenets of humoral theory was the importance of maintaining the body's natural heat. Cold was often associated with illness, specifically with an excess of phlegm, which could lead to chills, catarrh, and various ailments. To expose oneself to the cold, especially during sleep when the body was considered to be more vulnerable, was seen as an invitation to imbalance and sickness. Stripping down to a thin layer would be considered medically unsound, a reckless act that could lead to a chilling of the humors. Your layers of clothing, therefore, weren't just about physical warmth. They were about medicinal protection, preventing vital heat from escaping and maintaining the internal balance of your precious humors. It's like your Elizabethan doctor prescribed you an extra doublet for bedtime. Furthermore, the act of sweating was often considered beneficial, a way for the body to expel toxins and excess humors. Being well-wrapped, even in sleep, could induce a gentle perspiration, which was seen as a healthy bodily function. This is also why feverish patients were often wrapped in even more blankets, a practice that seems counterintuitive to us but made perfect sense within the humoral framework. Historians still argue whether the medical rationale for this practice was a primary cause or simply a convenient justification for an already established custom. A quirky tidbit: in addition to layers of clothing, some Elizabethan nobles would sleep with special heating bricks or bed warmers, essentially pans filled with hot coals, slid under their covers to further ensure a warm sleeping environment. This was another way to combat the cold and support the body's vital heat, making the whole sleeping arrangement a multi-pronged assault on imbalance. So, as you pull up your cozy duvet, imagine adding a few more blankets, then putting on your thickest clothes, and finally, sliding a hot brick under your feet, all in the name of good health. Ah, the subtle comforts of historical medicine. You're still there, warm under your layers, perhaps imagining the four humors sloshing contentedly within you. But amidst this landscape of perpetually dressed nobility, there was a glimmer, a faint whisper of something closer to what we might call true sleepwear. The role of the nightshirt. While largely an exception to the rule of sleeping fully dressed, the emergence and specific uses of the nightshirt offer fascinating insights into the evolving concept of nighttime comfort and privacy. For the vast majority of Elizabethan nobles, as we've established, their innermost linen shirt or chemise served as their default sleepwear. It was the garment closest to the skin, absorbent, and relatively easy to launder. However, for some of the very wealthiest, a distinct nightshirt did exist. This was not the thin, light cotton nightshirt you might envision today. Instead, it was often a substantially heavier, longer, and warmer garment, typically made of fine linen or even flannel. It was less about shedding layers for comfort and more about adding an extra layer for warmth on particularly cold nights, or for ceremonial purposes during a formal levee, the morning ritual of receiving visitors while still in bed. Imagine it after removing your outer doublet or gown. You might have another, even longer, heavier linen shirt slipped on over your regular one, perhaps reaching down to your ankles. This was an additional thermal barrier, a luxurious indulgence for those who could afford extra garments and the servants to manage them. It was not a sign of undressing. It was a sign of increasing one's protective, warm cocoon. Historians still argue whether the nightshirt's primary function was practical warmth or a symbol of extreme wealth and status. The nightshirt also sometimes served a semi-public function. As discussed, your bedchamber was not always a strictly private space. If you were receiving visitors during your morning levee, a fine, clean nightshirt provided a degree of modesty and decorum without requiring the full, laborious process of getting into your elaborate daytime clothes. It allowed you to maintain your aristocratic image even while ostensibly at rest. It's like wearing a very fancy, respectable bathrobe when you answer the door to a delivery driver. Rather than your actual pajamas, just much thicker. A quirky tidbit, some of these luxurious nightshirts were elaborately embroidered, particularly around the collar and cuffs, indicating their status as a garment of leisure and wealth, rather than just simple undergarments. This meant that even in your sleepwear, you were still broadcasting your elevated position. So, while the nightshirt offered a slight departure from sleeping in all your clothes, it wasn't a radical step towards modern comfort. It was a subtle, often expensive, addition to the already complex tapestry of Elizabethan dressing habits, reinforcing, rather than undermining, the period's unique approach to rest. You're still cocooned in your layers, perhaps imagining the rare luxury of a fine embroidered nightshirt. This brings us to another critical, yet often unseen component of Elizabethan noble life, the intricate web of support provided by your staff. The odd habit of nobles sleeping fully dressed wasn't a solitary eccentricity. It was deeply interwoven with servant life and noble slumber, highlighting the enormous logistical effort required to maintain aristocratic existence. Imagine your household a bustling ecosystem of cooks, scullery maids, grooms, laundresses, valets, chambermaids, pages, and a myriad of other specialized roles. Your personal comfort, even in the dead of night, depended entirely on their labor. The decision to sleep fully or mostly dressed, while seemingly simple for you, had profound implications for your servants. For example, if you rarely undressed fully, it reduced the daily burden on the laundresses who were responsible for the arduous task of washing and pressing all your elaborate garments. Given the challenges of pre-industrial laundry, lugging water, heating it, scrubbing by hand, and then drying and starching, any reduction in workload was significant. Your chambermaids and valets, who assisted with dressing and undressing, also benefited from this habit. Instead of a full, complex disrobing and redressing ritual twice a day, their tasks were simplified. They might still help you remove outer gowns, loosen laces, or adjust your inner garments. But the sheer effort was considerably less than a complete change. This allowed them to attend to other duties, or even get a few more precious moments of sleep themselves, as their days were long and arduous, often beginning before dawn and ending long after you had retired. Historians still argue whether the reduction in servant workload was a deliberate motivation for the sleeping habits or merely a beneficial byproduct. Furthermore, the constant proximity of servants, as we've touched upon, was not just for convenience. It was a fundamental aspect of Elizabethan aristocratic life. A chambermaid might sleep at the foot of your bed, a page just outside the door, ensuring you were never truly alone and always within earshot of assistance. This also meant that you were rarely, if ever, completely out of sight. Maintaining a degree of dress, even in sleep, was part of that unspoken contract of perpetual readiness and decorum, not just for your benefit, but for theirs as well, as it streamlined their duties and maintained the smooth functioning of the household. It's like a perpetually staffed hotel, where the guests are the nobility and the staff are always on call. A quirky tidbit, some very high-ranking nobles even had specialized bedchamber servants whose primary role was to attend to their lord or lady during the night, bringing drinks, assisting with bodily functions, or simply being there in case of need. These servants would often sleep just outside the bed hangings or in a small adjoining closet. So, even as you drifted off, you were part of a team effort, with your peculiar sleeping habits helping to orchestrate the grand ballet of aristocratic domestic life. You're still picturing that bustling Elizabethan household, your sleep subtly orchestrated by the tireless efforts of your unseen staff. Now, let's widen our gaze from the individual noble to the bed itself and the very intimate, often surprisingly public, concept of family dynamics and shared spaces. In the Elizabethan era, this cultural norm of shared beds, even among the nobility, further reinforced the practicality of sleeping fully or mostly dressed, blurring our modern distinctions of privacy. Imagine your grand bed, but now picture it not just as your personal sanctuary, but as a multi-purpose, often multi-person, sleeping platform. The nuclear family, as we understand it today, parents and children in separate bedrooms, was far from the norm. It was incredibly common for noble parents to share their magnificent bed with their younger children. Infants and toddlers might sleep tucked in beside their parents for warmth, security, and ease of nighttime feeding or comforting. This wasn't a sign of poverty or lack of space, but a deeply ingrained cultural practice rooted in historical precedent and practical considerations. Beyond immediate family, beds might also be shared with other close family members, or even honored guests, especially in smaller manor houses or during large gatherings. The concept of a dedicated guest bedroom was still evolving. Imagine the logistics of sleepovers where you might find yourself sharing a substantial bed with a visiting cousin or a distant relative. In such scenarios, maintaining a degree of modesty by remaining dressed, even loosely, was simply practical and polite. You wouldn't want to expose yourself completely in front of non-immediate family members, even if everyone was technically asleep. It's like when you're camping with friends and you definitely don't strip down to your undies in the tent. Multiply that feeling by about 10, add some velvet, and you're there. This constant cohabitation, even during sleep, naturally diminished the expectation of complete personal privacy. The very act of undressing and dressing became less of a solitary, intimate moment and more of a semi-public ritual, performed with an awareness of others' presence. Your clothes, therefore, served not only as warmth or a status symbol, but also as a kind of personal barrier, a modest buffer in these shared sleeping environments. Historians still argue whether this widespread bed sharing fostered stronger familial bonds or simply reflected the practical limitations of space and heating. A quirky tidbit: in some grand houses, specific beds were reserved for guests and were known by names, much like rooms. These beds were often dressed with the finest linens and hangings, designed to impress. Yet, even in such a luxurious setting, the expectation for guests was often to retain most of their clothes, maintaining decorum even when sharing space. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps alone in your perfectly private bed, consider the bustling, shared reality of your Elizabethan ancestors, where even slumber was a communal affair, often negotiated in layers of wool and linen. You're still imagining those shared beds, perhaps feeling a newfound appreciation for your own private sleeping space. Now, let's take our journey across the diverse landscape of Elizabethan England, comparing and contrasting sleep customs between the bustling heart of power and the quieter corners of the realm. We'll observe how the noble habit of sleeping fully dressed manifested differently, from court to countryside. Train, imagine yourself at the heart of the kingdom. In London, perhaps at Whitehall Palace, the residence of Queen Elizabeth II. Here, life was a perpetual whirl of activity, intrigue, and rigid court etiquette. The demands of immediate readiness were paramount. You, as a courtier, might be summoned by the Queen at any hour for a council meeting, an urgent dispatch, or even a sudden entertainment. To be found fumbling with your clothing would be an unforgivable breach of protocol, an indication of unreadiness that could severely damage your standing. Therefore, at court, the practice of sleeping mostly dressed was likely even more rigorously observed. driven by the intense social pressure and the ever-present need to impress and be available to the monarch. The layers of political maneuvering were almost as thick as the layers of clothing. Now, transport yourself to your sprawling manor house in the remote countryside, far from the direct gaze of the queen and the constant churn of court life. Here, while still a noble of significant standing, the pace of life was slower, the threats perhaps more localized, a dispute with a neighboring landowner, a local uprising, rather than a national conspiracy. In this setting, the practical reasons for sleeping dressed, warmth in drafty stone buildings, protection against pests, quick readiness for a fire or a local raid, remain strong. The social pressures, however, were less about grand display and more about maintaining local authority and managing your estate. You might still keep most of your clothes on, but perhaps with a slightly more relaxed attitude, loosening a few more points than you would at court. Historians still argue whether regional variations in climate or social structure had a greater impact on noble sleeping habits. A quirky tidbit: some very wealthy nobles maintained multiple sets of their most elaborate clothing, specifically designated for court wear, and other, slightly less formal but still impressive, garments for their country estates. This differentiation, however, rarely extended to separate pajamas for each setting. The core principle of sleeping in layers remained consistent, a testament to its pervasive practicality across different noble environments. So, whether you were dodging political machinations in a drafty palace or overseeing your tenants in a chilly manor, your method of slumber remained largely the same, a testament to the enduring influence of the era's unique blend of practicality, status, and the ever-present cold. You're still imagining the various noble sleeping scenarios, from bustling court to quiet countryside, all united by the common thread of layered slumber. This brings us to a fascinating tangent: the evolution of pajamas. Or rather, why this concept was so incredibly slow to develop in Elizabethan England. Your ancestors weren't just stubbornly clinging to old habits. The very idea of distinct, comfortable sleepwear was a foreign concept, still centuries away from mainstream adoption in the West. Imagine, for a moment, the vast difference between your silky, breathable pajamas and the heavy, often stiff, layers of an Elizabethan noble's night attire. The word pajama itself is derived from the Persian pajama, meaning leg garment, and referred to loose-fitting trousers worn in India and the Middle East. These comfortable, practical garments were encountered by Europeans through trade and colonization. But it took a long, long time for the idea to migrate from exotic Eastern attire to commonplace Western sleepwear. For Elizabethans, the idea of wearing loose trousers and a soft top solely for sleeping would have seemed utterly nonsensical, perhaps even scandalous in its informality. The reasons for this slow adoption are multifaceted. Firstly, as we've discussed, the concept of a private sphere, particularly for the nobility, was far less defined than it is today. You were rarely truly alone, even in your bedchamber. The necessity of maintaining decorum and readiness, even in sleep, militated against the development of truly relaxed garments. Secondly, the prevailing medical beliefs of the time, emphasizing warmth and the avoidance of chills, further discouraged shedding layers. Loose, thin garments would have been seen as an invitation to illness, not comfort. Historians still argue whether the lack of distinct sleepwear was due to cultural conservatism or the absence of appropriate textile technology. Furthermore, the clothing was expensive. Every garment was a significant investment, often hand-stitched and made from valuable fabrics. To dedicate an entire set of clothing solely for sleeping, distinct from one's day clothes or even one's innermost linen shift, would have seemed extravagant and wasteful to all but the very wealthiest. And even then, it was more likely to be an additional warming layer rather than a truly separate night outfit. It's like buying a tuxedo just to lounge around the house in. It simply wouldn't make economic sense in their world. A quirky tidbit: while true pajamas were absent, some of the very richest nobles might have possessed dressing gowns or nightgowns. But these were elaborate, often fur-lined robes worn over their regular clothes for warmth or decorum in the morning or evening. They were external garments for semi-public appearance, not soft, intimate sleepwear. So, as you slip into your favorite soft sleep shorts or silk nightdress tonight, remember that you are part of a long, slow evolution of comfort, an evolution that your Elizabethan ancestor, sleeping resolutely in their everyday layers, couldn't even have begun to dream of. You're still contemplating the slow march of sartorial progress, or lack thereof, in Elizabethan sleepwear. Now, let's turn our gaze to the visual record. What did the artists of the time choose to show us about how nobles slept? Examining these artistic depictions of sleep can offer tantalizing clues about Elizabethan bedtime attire, even if these portrayals are often idealized or symbolic rather than strictly realistic. Imagine a grand portrait from the era. You'll see nobles in their magnificent daytime finery, every detail meticulously rendered, the sheen of velvet, the intricate lace of a ruff, the gleam of jewels. But what about scenes of rest, unsurprisingly? Depictions of individuals fully undressed and vulnerable in bed are exceedingly rare, particularly for the nobility. This reinforces the idea that even in sleep, a certain decorum and presentation was maintained, or so that artists preferred to portray their subjects in a state of controlled dignity. More often, when sleep or a bedchamber scene is depicted, the subject, if noble, is usually shown in a linen shift or chemise, their innermost garment. This is the closest you'll get to underwear in these paintings. However, even these shifts are often portrayed as surprisingly substantial, sometimes with sleeves, and certainly not the flimsy, translucent lingerie of later centuries. Often, a bed curtain is strategically pulled, or the figure is partially obscured, suggesting a degree of modesty even within the confines of art. This selective portrayal speaks volumes about societal expectations regarding visibility and privacy. Historians still argue whether the modesty and artistic depictions reflected actual habits or merely idealized public presentation. Sometimes, you might see a figure in a nightgown or dressing gown, those elaborate, often fur-lined robes we discussed, worn over other layers, rather than as standalone sleepwear. These garments conveyed wealth and comfort, suitable for receiving a morning visitor or a quick stroll across a cold chamber. They were part of the dressed persona, even if a slightly relaxed one. It's a bit like seeing a celebrity in a plush hotel robe in a magazine. It still conveys luxury, not complete vulnerability. A quirky tidbit, one of the rare instances of more natural sleep depictions, might be found in very specific historical illustrations, such as those detailing medical procedures or, more morbidly, death scenes, where the deceased might be shown in a simple shift. Even then, the focus is rarely on their attire, but on the event itself. So, while you might not find a grand painting titled Noblewoman snoring in her breeches, the subtle cues in the art of the period and the noticeable absence of certain portrayals firmly support the notion that full undressing for sleep was simply not the visual norm for the Elizabethan elite. You're still sifting through the visual evidence, noticing what isn't shown as much as what is. Now, let's shift our focus to the written word. What can literary mentions and omissions tell us about Elizabethan sleeping habits by scrutinizing the plays, poems, and personal correspondence of the era? We can glean subtle insights into how sleep and dress were portrayed, or conspicuously ignored, by the writers who chronicled their times. Imagine diving into the works of William Shakespeare, the quintessential Elizabethan chronicler. While his plays are rich with details about daily life, love, death, and social customs, explicit descriptions of characters undressing for sleep, or even of distinct nightwear in the modern sense, are strikingly rare. When characters retire, they often simply go to bed, with little fanfare about disrobing. For instance, in Othello, when the tragic hero confronts Desdemona in her bedchamber, she is referred to as being in her bedgown, which would have been a fine, voluminous shift worn for modesty in the semi-public space of a noble bedroom, not a flimsy nightie. It reinforces the idea that even in bed, a degree of dignified covering was maintained. Poetry of the era, while often romanticizing love and longing, rarely delves into the mundane details of how one actually prepared for slumber. The focus is on the emotional state, the dreamscape, or the beloved's beauty, not on the practicalities of their linen layers. This omission is significant. If a widespread custom of stripping down to something light and comfortable for sleep existed, it's reasonable to assume it would have found its way into descriptions of intimacy or vulnerability. Its absence speaks volumes. Historians still argue whether this lack of detailed description implies a habit so common it wasn't worth mentioning, or a deliberate avoidance of an unglamorous reality, even in personal letters or household accounts. While there are meticulous inventories of garments, specific items designated solely for sleepwear are almost non-existent beyond the general shirts or shifts which also served as underwear. This further supports the idea that the same basic undergarments worn during the day often doubled as nightwear, perhaps merely loosened for comfort. It's a bit like writing a diary entry and simply saying, "I went to bed," without elaborating on the specific brand of pajamas you put on. It's just going to bed. A quirky tidbit, one of the more telling literary references, might come from descriptions of surprise attacks or sudden alarms in the night. Characters are often depicted as immediately ready for action, grabbing swords and rushing out, implying they weren't in a state of complete undress. It's subtle, but it adds another layer to our understanding. So, as you read your favorite historical novel, pay attention not just to what the characters say and do, but also to what the authors don't say about their nightly routines. Sometimes, silence is the loudest clue. You're still piecing together the puzzle of Elizabethan sleep from the subtle hints in literature. Now, let's talk about something truly fundamental to their lives, something that underpinned every decision about clothing: the economics of clothing. For the Elizabethan noble, every garment was a significant asset, a testament to wealth, and a considerable investment. Understanding this economic reality sheds immense light on why stripping off your elaborate, costly attire for a mere 8 hours of sleep was simply not a sensible proposition. Imagine the cost. Fabrics like silk, velvet, and fine wool were imported and incredibly expensive. Dyes were rare and costly. The intricate lace, the embroidery with gold or silver thread, the pearls and jewels sewn onto garments. These were luxuries beyond imagination for the vast majority of the population. A nobleman's doublet or a lady's gown could easily cost the equivalent of a small house, or even an entire year's income for a yeoman farmer. These were not disposable fashion items. They were precious, durable goods, meant to last for years, often passed down through generations. To casually discard them at night, only to put them on again in the morning, seemed utterly wasteful. Furthermore, the construction of these garments was immensely labor-intensive. Tailors, seamstresses, embroiderers, skilled artisans spent countless hours creating these masterpieces. Every stitch represented time and expertise, adding to the overall value. To subject such valuable items to the potential wear and tear of being repeatedly taken off and put on, especially without modern care techniques, would have been seen as poor stewardship of one's assets. By sleeping in many of their layers, perhaps just loosening the outer ones, they minimized the stress on the fabric and the elaborate fastenings, effectively preserving their investment. It's like deciding to keep your car idling rather than turning it off and on repeatedly to save wear and tear on the engine. Only the car is your very expensive wardrobe. This economic reality also influenced laundry habits. As discussed before, washing was harsh, and frequent washing would quickly degrade expensive fabrics. By keeping the innermost linen layers as the primary washable items and retaining the outer, more valuable garments for sleep, nobles extended the life of their costly wardrobe. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws, which dictated who could wear what fabrics, were more about social control or economic protection for the elite. A quirky tidbit, some wealthier nobles would even have specific clauses in their wills detailing the inheritance of individual garments, recognizing their significant monetary and sentimental value. These were not just clothes, they were heirlooms. So, as you gaze at your closet filled with affordable, easily replaceable garments. Spare a thought for your Elizabethan counterpart, whose nightly decision to sleep dressed was as much about protecting their personal wealth as it was about comfort or custom. You're still contemplating the economic gravity of Elizabethan clothing, a concept far removed from our fast fashion world. Now, let's pivot to a more visceral reality that heavily influenced nocturnal habits, the sheer, bone-chilling cold of cold castles and drafty rooms. Your grand Elizabethan manor, for all its imposing architecture and lavish furnishings, was fundamentally a poorly insulated, often frigid environment, particularly during the long, dark English winters. Imagine your bedchamber. The walls are thick stone, designed for defense, not warmth. Windows, if glazed, were often small and inefficient, letting in more drafts than light. Fireplaces, while present, provided only localized heat. They would warm a small radius around the hearth, but the warmth dissipated quickly into the vast, high-ceilinged spaces. The idea of central heating was centuries away. Even elaborate hearths couldn't truly warm an entire room, let alone an entire castle, to a comfortable temperature. As soon as the fire died down, which it inevitably would during the night, the cold would creep back in, swiftly and mercilessly. This meant that your bed, even with its heavy hangings, was a vital, albeit limited, warm zone. Every layer of clothing you kept on was a personal, portable insulator. Your wool breeches, your padded doublet, your heavy petticoats. These weren't just fashion statements. They were survival gear against the encroaching chill. To strip down to a thin linen shift would have been an invitation to shiver through the night, risking not just discomfort, but, according to the medical beliefs of the time, illness. Historians still argue whether the physical discomfort of cold was a greater determinant of sleep habits than social convention. Consider the sensation of climbing into a bed where the sheets, despite being covered by heavy blankets, felt damp and icy. Your own body heat, trapped by your layers, was a precious commodity. By sleeping dressed, you maximized your personal warmth, creating a microclimate within your bed that was slightly more hospitable than the room around you. It's like sleeping in a very fancy sleeping bag, but one made of silk and wool that you've been wearing all day. A truly cozy experience, perhaps if you manage to ignore the stiffness. A quirky tidbit to combat the extreme cold. Some wealthy nobles would have servants place hot bricks or pans of embers bed warmers between the sheets before they retired, providing a fleeting warmth that quickly dissipated. Even with these, the underlying need for personal insulation remained paramount. So, as you adjust your thermostat to a comfortable temperature tonight, remember your Elizabethan counterpart, whose nightly battle against the pervasive cold was a silent, persistent reason to embrace the odd habit of sleeping fully dressed. You're still feeling the chill of those stone walls, grateful for modern climate control, but now, let's tiptoe into the shadows and explore how superstitions and nighttime fears might have subtly influenced the Elizabethan habit of sleeping fully dressed. The world of the Elizabethans was far more steeped in belief in the supernatural, the unseen, and the ever-present potential for malevolent forces than our own. And this worldview seeped into every aspect of their lives, even their slumber. Imagine the darkness of an Elizabethan night, lit only by flickering candlelight or the pale glow of the moon. There were no streetlights, no constant hum of electricity. The silence could be profound, punctuated only by the creaks of the house, the whispers of the wind, or the scurrying of unseen creatures. In such an environment, the mind was fertile ground for fears of ghosts, spirits, demons, and the ever-present threat of witchcraft. People genuinely believed that malevolent entities could appear, or that their souls could be vulnerable during sleep. While not a direct causal link, the habit of sleeping dressed could be seen as a subtle form of protection, a psychological barrier against the unknown. Just as your clothes protected you from the cold and the prying eyes of servants, they might also offer a symbolic defense against unseen evils. Being prepared, even in slumber, perhaps gave a sense of security against a sudden spiritual assault, or the need to quickly flee a haunted chamber. It's like how you might pull the covers over your head when you were a child, not just from the cold, but from the monsters under the bed. Only for the Elizabethans, those monsters felt a lot more real. The concept of a vulnerable soul leaving the body during sleep was also prevalent in some folk beliefs. Remaining dressed, therefore, might have been a way of keeping oneself bound or protected, ensuring that your soul didn't wander too far or become susceptible to dark influences. While perhaps not a conscious, everyday decision, these underlying fears contributed to a general ethos of vigilance and self-preservation, even when resting. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were a major driver of daily habits or simply reflections of a deeper societal anxiety. A quirky tidbit: some people would place protective charms or religious objects near their beds, or even wear them while sleeping, to ward off nightmares or evil spirits. These could range from crosses to sprigs of rosemary or specific herbs believed to have protective qualities. So, imagine sleeping fully dressed, perhaps with a small, fragrant sachet of herbs under your pillow, all to ensure a night free from both drafts and demonic visitations. Truly, their bedtime routine was a multi-layered defense system. You're still wrapped in the lingering anxieties of Elizabethan superstitions, picturing protective charms and hidden herbs. Now, let's peel back another layer of the noble household, moving beyond the grand public spaces and into the more intimate, though still not entirely private, domain of the sphere or privy chamber's secrets. This was a lady's personal withdrawing room, often adjoining her bedchamber, and the activities here shed further light on why complete undressing for sleep was such an anomaly. Imagine the privy chamber, a room designed for more personal moments, for conversations with trusted confidants, or for intimate tasks like hairstyling or receiving very close visitors. While still attended by select servants, it was a step removed from the formal reception rooms. Here, you, the noble lady, might loosen your outermost gown, or even your stays if you truly sought some comfort, but you would rarely, if ever, be completely undressed. The chemise, your innermost linen shift, would still be your primary layer, and often, your petticoats and stockings would remain on. The routines performed in this chamber were all about subtle transitions, not radical transformations. Your hair, for instance, might be brushed, rebraided, or even powdered here before bed, a process that could take considerable time and required the assistance of your gentlewomen. The thought of then completely disrobing and putting on a flimsy nightgown would feel jarring, undoing all the careful preparation. It was about maintaining a state of decorum, even in these slightly more relaxed moments, ensuring that if a trusted servant or even your husband entered, you would still be presented in an appropriate, modest fashion. Historians still argue whether the concept of privacy within these chambers was about actual solitude or merely a reduction in the number of watchful eyes. Consider the practicalities of bodily functions. While chamber pots were used and discreetly emptied by servants, the idea of a fully exposed body during such moments was likely avoided where possible. Maintaining some layers provided a quick sense of cover and modesty. It's like how you might still wear a robe even when stepping from your bed to the bathroom, just for that extra layer of comfort and privacy, even if no one else is around. Only for the Elizabethan noble, no one else around was a rare luxury. A quirky tidbit sometimes. A noblewoman might have a special dressing table or toilette table in her privy chamber, where her combs, mirrors, and cosmetic ingredients often made from herbs or animal fats would be laid out. Even these seemingly intimate rituals were often performed with an attendant present. So, as you picture the Elizabethan noble preparing for bed, imagine a subtle unwinding, a gradual loosening of layers, but almost never a complete shedding of the protective, customary envelope of their clothing, even in the most private corners of their grand, bustling homes. You're still imagining the semi-private rituals of the privy chamber, where layers were loosened but rarely fully shed. Now, let's consider the ultimate arbiters of fashion and custom in Elizabethan England, the monarchs themselves. Did figures like Elizabeth of Foreign, the Virgin Queen, adhere to the odd habit of sleeping fully dressed? Or did her royal status grant her a unique exception? Investigating Pranar, royal habits and influence, provides crucial insight into the pervasiveness of this custom. Imagine Queen Elizabeth I, the most powerful woman in England, famed for her elaborate gowns, magnificent ruffs, and an almost superhuman dedication to her image. Her daily dressing ritual was a complex affair, requiring multiple ladies-in-waiting, hours of meticulous work, and a dazzling array of garments. She was, quite literally, dressed to impress, every single day. So, what happened when the Queen retired for the night? Historical accounts suggest that even the monarch, for all her power and privacy, largely adhered to the practice of sleeping in most of her clothes. She would typically remove her outermost gown, her ruff, and perhaps her farthingale, the skirt-expanding framework. However, her shift, petticoats, and often her stockings would remain on. The sheer effort of fully disrobing and then redressing such an iconic figure twice a day would have been monumental. Even for a queen with countless attendants, efficiency, even for royalty, was a factor. More importantly, the queen's bedchamber was never truly private. She conducted her levee, her morning reception, from her bed, receiving important ministers, foreign ambassadors, and favored courtiers. To be seen in a state of undress during such crucial political moments would have been unthinkable. Her nightgown, if worn, would have been an elaborate, sometimes fur-lined, outer robe designed for modesty and warmth during these semi-public audiences, reinforcing her regal presence even in bed. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's personal habits were driven more by political necessity or genuine preference for warmth and tradition. The Queen's adherence to this custom also served to normalize it for the entire court, and, by extension, the wider nobility. If the monarch, the pinnacle of society, found it acceptable and practical to sleep mostly dressed, then it further cemented the habit as a standard of aristocratic living. It was a subtle form of royal influence, shaping the customs of the age simply through her personal practice. It's like seeing your CEO show up in a casual outfit, and suddenly everyone else feels okay dressing down a bit. Only for Elizabeth, it was the opposite. Her consistent formality, even in bed, set the tone. A quirky tidbit: Elizabeth I was known for her frugality with some personal expenses. Despite her vast wealth, conserving the wear and tear on her incredibly expensive clothing by not fully undressing would have been a practical consideration, even for a queen. So, as you envision Elizabeth, famously grand and perpetually on, remember that even her nightly repose was a carefully managed affair, reflecting the blend of practicality, status, and custom that defined Elizabethan noble life. You're still envisioning the Queen, regal even in her sleep attire, a testament to the custom's reach. This royal example underscores a broader point: how the practice of sleeping fully dressed subtly reinforced, or sometimes even challenged, the intricate scaffolding of the great chain of being at rest. This medieval concept, still profoundly influential in Elizabethan thought, posited a divinely ordained hierarchy of all creation, from God down to the lowest pebble, and even in the private moments of slumber, echoes of this rigid social structure could be found. Imagine this societal ladder, with God at the very top, followed by angels, monarchs, nobles, gentry, yeomen, and finally, the vast peasantry. Every person had their appointed place, and their clothing, their dwelling, and even their daily routines, including sleep, were expected to reflect that position. For a noble and maintaining a degree of decorum and preparedness, even in the presumed privacy of their bedchamber, was a way of living up to their divinely ordained status. To appear disheveled, vulnerable, or completely undressed could be seen as a symbolic shedding of one's place in this great cosmic order. It's like a CEO showing up to a board meeting in their pajamas. It simply doesn't fit their position on the corporate chain. Conversely, the fact that even nobles, despite their immense wealth and privilege, shared many of the same practical constraints as those below them, the cold, the pests, the lack of modern conveniences, also offered a subtle counterpoint. While their beds were grander and their clothes finer, the fundamental reasons for sleeping dressed, warmth, security, efficiency were universal. This shared human experience, albeit at different levels of luxury, subtly blurred the rigid lines of the chain of being, demonstrating that even the highest noble was still subject to the basic realities of the physical world. Historians still argue whether the chain of being was a tool for social control or a genuine reflection of contemporary worldview. However, the hierarchy also manifested in the details. While a noble might sleep in their chemise, a peasant would sleep in the rough, coarse shirt they wore all day, perhaps even sharing a straw pallet with farm animals. The underlying reason warmth, simplicity might be similar, but the quality of the garments and bedding and the overall context highlighted the vast chasm between their respective places on the chain. A noble's undress was a silk chemise, a peasant's was ragged wool. A quirky tidbit, even the posture of sleep was sometimes believed to reflect one's state within the chain. Sleeping on one's back was occasionally associated with a more dignified or virtuous soul, while restless or face-down sleep could be seen as a sign of a troubled conscience or lower spiritual standing. So, as you lay in your bed, remember that for your Elizabethan counterpart, even the seemingly simple act of going to sleep was entangled with the grand, invisible structure of their entire universe. You're still contemplating the hierarchical implications of Elizabethan sleep, where even repose had its place in the cosmic order. Now, let's consider a common scenario in the noble world, the phenomenon of having guests stay overnight. How did guest etiquette and sleepovers operate in an era where sleeping fully dressed was the norm, and privacy, as we understand it, was a rare commodity? Imagine you are a noble guest arriving at a friend's country estate for a prolonged visit. You've traveled for days, probably enduring uncomfortable roads and basic inns. Upon arrival, you'd be welcomed, fed, and shown to your allotted chamber. This chamber, while perhaps grand, might not have been exclusively yours. As we discussed, bed sharing was common, and you might find yourself sharing a substantial bed with other guests of similar status, or perhaps with a trusted servant from your own retinue. The concept of a dedicated, private guest room for every individual was a luxury largely unheard of. In such a communal sleeping environment, the practice of sleeping mostly dressed became even more critical for you as a guest. It was a matter of both practicality and courtesy. You wouldn't want to cause discomfort or embarrassment by fully disrobing in front of others, even if they were familiar faces. Maintaining your shift, petticoats, breeches, and stockings provided a continuous layer of modesty. It also meant you were ready for any unexpected wake-up call, whether it was a servant bringing a morning drink, a fellow guest stirring, or an emergency in the house. It's much like how you might pack a modest sleeping outfit for a shared Airbnb or a friend's couch, consciously choosing something that allows for dignity in shared spaces. Only you're for the Elizabethans. That modest outfit was pretty much what you wore all day. Furthermore, the host, by providing a bed, was extending a significant act of hospitality. Your behavior as a guest reflected not only on you, but also, subtly, on the host. Appearing properly attired, even for sleep, was a sign of respect for your host's household and their customs. To completely strip down might have been seen as overly informal, even disrespectful, in a society that valued decorum above almost all else. Historians still argue whether guest comfort or adherence to social norms was the greater priority in such arrangements. A quirky tidbit: some very elaborate beds, designed specifically for guests, even had their own names, passed down through generations. These state beds were often adorned with incredible carvings and hangings, making them truly imposing pieces of furniture. Yet even in such magnificent settings, the human occupants within were still largely wrapped in their daily layers. So, the next time you have a friend over for a sleepover, perhaps lend them a pair of comfy pajamas and appreciate just how far we've come from the days of shared beds and perpetual dress codes. You're still envisioning the intricacies of Elizabethan guest etiquette, where even a sleepover was a study in layered formality. Now, let's gaze forward, beyond the reign of Gloriana, and consider the changing tides of fashion that would eventually, subtly, lead to the gradual development of dedicated sleepwear. The Elizabethan habit of sleeping fully dressed, while deeply entrenched, was not eternal. It was merely a snapshot in the long, slow evolution of human comfort and changing societal norms. Imagine the subtle shifts beginning to occur even towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, and more significantly into the Jacobean and Caroline periods early to mid-17th century. As the centuries progressed, new ideas about personal hygiene, privacy, and indeed, comfort slowly began to emerge, driven by a combination of social change, technological advancements, and shifting philosophical viewpoints. The rigid formality of Elizabethan fashion, with its stiff ruffs and padded doublets, would eventually give way to looser, more flowing styles that were inherently easier to don and doff. The concept of a separate bedchamber as a truly private space for the individual or immediate couple began to gain more traction, leading to a greater expectation of privacy and, consequently, a greater willingness to shed the day's cumbersome attire. As homes evolved to include more specialized rooms and heating methods improved, the sheer necessity of sleeping in multiple layers for warmth would gradually lessen. Historians still argue whether the decline of the fully dressed sleep habit was a result of changing fashion or evolving social conceptions of privacy. Furthermore, textiles themselves would slowly change. The widespread availability of lighter, softer fabrics like cotton, imported from the East, would eventually make truly comfortable, breathable sleepwear a practical reality. Imagine the stark contrast between a heavy wool doublet and a light cotton nightgown, the latter offering a level of comfort previously unimaginable. But this was a slow burn, not an overnight revolution. It would take centuries for pajamas as we know them to become commonplace. A quirky tidbit even as the custom of sleeping fully dressed faded. The concept of the dressing gown or nightgown, a formal, often luxurious robe worn over sleepwear or underlayers, gained prominence, signifying a new stage in the aristocratic ritual of preparing for and rising from bed. This garment bridged the gap between the fully dressed daytime persona and the more relaxed, but still dignified, nighttime self. So, while your Elizabethan ancestor might have looked at your modern pajamas with utter bewilderment, the seeds of that comfort were very, very slowly beginning to be sown in the shifting sands of fashion and daily life. You're peering into the future of fashion, seeing the faint glimmer of pajamas on the horizon. But let's pull back to the present of our historical narrative and consider the enduring legacy of the fully dressed sleeper. This seemingly odd habit, once so prevalent among Elizabethan nobles, left an imprint on later generations' perceptions of historical daily life, shaping our understanding of comfort, privacy, and even the very rhythm of time past. Imagine how this historical reality contrasts with the romanticized images of the past, often found in literature and film. We tend to project our modern sensibilities onto historical figures, assuming they sought comfort and privacy in ways similar to our own. The notion of a noble lady elegantly slipping into a delicate nightdress, or a gentleman in silk pajamas, is a pervasive anachronism. The truth, as we've explored, was far less glamorous, more practical, and often, frankly, a bit itchy. This contrast forces us to confront the stark differences in daily life, compelling us to truly step into their world, rather than merely observing it from our comfortable vantage point. Historians still argue whether historical narratives overly focus on the exceptional rather than the mundane aspects of daily life. The legacy also lies in challenging our assumptions about progress. We often view history as a linear march towards ever-increasing comfort and convenience. The Elizabethan sleeping habits remind us that what we consider uncomfortable or even unsanitary today was perfectly normal, even practical for them. It forces us to ask what seemingly strange habits do we have today that future generations will find utterly baffling. Perhaps our obsession with smart devices in the bedroom, or our reliance on artificial climate control, might seem peculiar to someone in the year 25 and 25. This enduring image of the fully dressed sleeper also serves as a powerful symbol of an era defined by constant social performance. Even in repose, the Elizabethan noble maintained a dignified, public-facing persona. It speaks to a society where the lines between public and private were incredibly blurred, where one's personal space was constantly subject to the gaze of others. Your clothes were your armor, your status symbol, and your protection, even against the cold and the prying eyes of the night. A quirky tidbit, the very phrase getting dressed still carries a subtle echo of this historical layeredness, as if implying a multi-stage process rather than just slipping on a single garment. While the practice itself faded, its underlying logic, rooted in practicality and social display, continued to inform the nuances of aristocratic presentation for centuries. So, as you reflect on this peculiar custom, know that it's more than just a historical curiosity. It's a window into a fundamentally different way of existing, a past that truly was a foreign country. You're reflecting on the lingering legacy of Elizabethan slumber, contemplating how different their world was from our own. Yet, surprisingly, if we squint just right, we can find a modern echoes of ancient habits, even in our highly technological, comfort-obsessed lives. While you might not sleep in a full doublet and breeches, some of our seemingly innocuous daily routines carry faint whispers of those centuries-old customs. Imagine, for instance, that incredibly cold night when the heating goes out, or you're camping and you decide to sleep in your sweatpants, a hoodie, and thick socks. You're layering for warmth, much like your Elizabethan ancestor, albeit with vastly more comfortable fabrics. Or consider the phenomenon of power napping at your desk, perhaps just loosening your tie or kicking off your shoes, but remaining otherwise dressed, ready to spring back into action. It's a distant, corporate cousin to the noble's need for immediate readiness for a summons from the queen. Then there's the subtle, almost unconscious act of maintaining a degree of modesty even in our most private spaces. How many of us, upon hearing an unexpected knock at the door, quickly pull on a robe or ensure we're decent before answering this instinct? The desire to present oneself appropriately even in a state of relaxation is a faint echo of the Elizabethan nobles' constant awareness of being observed, even by their servants. Your modern bathrobe, in a way, is a descendant of the Elizabethan nightgown, a garment for semi-public modesty within the home. Historians still argue whether human behavior contains inherent, unchanging patterns despite vast cultural shifts. And what about the sheer value we place on certain garments? While not an entire estate, you might have a very expensive suit, a designer dress, or a prized vintage item that you treat with extreme care, rarely washing it, and always hanging it up just so. This reverence for valuable clothing, the desire to prolong its life, mirrors the Elizabethan nobles' economic imperative to protect their costly wardrobe, even by sleeping in it to minimize wear and tear from constant removal. A quirky tidbit even today, many people sleep with their phone right by their bed, on vibrate, ready to be summoned by a late-night email or a breaking news alert. This might not be a threat to life and limb, but it's a technological equivalent of the Elizabethan noble keeping a dagger under the pillow, always subtly on call, always prepared for the unexpected intrusion of the outside world into their slumber. So as you cozy up tonight, consider these faint, modern reverberations of a very old, very practical way of sleeping. You're now looking at our own modern habits through an Elizabethan lens, finding the unexpected echoes of their very different lives. As our journey through the peculiar sleeping habits of Elizabethan nobles draws to a close, let's settle into the quiet wisdom of the past, okay, allowing these odd customs to softly illuminate the profound differences and surprising continuities in the human experience across centuries. Tonight, we've unraveled the layers, literally and figuratively, of a world where comfort, as we know it, was a luxury rarely pursued in slumber. You felt the cold seeping through stone walls, understood the intricate demands of fashion, considered the omnipresent threats that made readiness a virtue, and glimpsed the bustling, shared reality of noble households. It's a stark reminder that the way we live, the things we take for granted, privacy, warmth, abundant clean water, the very concept of pajamas, are not universal truths, but the products of specific historical circumstances. The Elizabethans, in their full dress sleep, weren't being stubborn or foolish. They were being profoundly practical, responding to the cold realities of their homes, the economic value of their clothes, the persistent presence of others, and the ever-present demands of social status and personal safety. Their odd habit was, in fact, a remarkably sensible adaptation to their world, a quiet testament to human ingenuity in the face of discomfort and constraint. As the final flickering images of candlelit bedchambers and rustling velvet fade, take a moment to simply appreciate the profound contrast. Feel the softness of your own chosen sleepwear, the comforting warmth of your heated home, the reassuring solitude of your personal space. These are luxuries that your Elizabethan noble counterpart, for all their wealth and power, could barely have imagined. The past, in its quiet wisdom, doesn't just offer us facts and dates, it offers perspective. It allows us to step outside our own assumptions, to understand that comfort is relative, that privacy is a modern invention, and that human beings across all eras find ingenious ways to adapt to their circumstances. It reminds us to cherish the conveniences we often overlook, and to appreciate the long, winding path that humanity has traveled, one sleepy, fully dressed night at a time. Now, let your thoughts drift, gently, away from grand beds and stiff doublets. Allow the images to soften, to blur, and to dissolve into the quiet comfort of your own room. The echoes of history are fading, replaced by the soft hum of your fan, the steady rhythm of your breath. Just relax, letting the day's journey, in our historical adventure, gently release their hold. The night is quiet, and the world is slowly, peacefully, at rest. Sweet dreams.